Okay, it's 6:30. I think we'll begin. Welcome to the Franklin Public Library's Great Decisions discussion program tonight. Tonight we have Beth Dougherty here from Beloit College. Before I introduce her, I will thank our sponsors, the Franklin Public Library Foundation, the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation, Carol and Tom Donovan, in memory of our library friend Dora Sargent. Before I introduce our speaker, I will mention, if you could hold off on any questions during the presentation, and then there'll be time after the presentation to ask questions. And at that time, we have time for people to ask one question. And if everybody's asked their questions and we still have time, you can ask a second question. But it's going to be a packed presentation tonight, I think. So we'll see. Dr. Beth Dougherty is the Manger Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her MA and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. She has chaired the Beloit College's International Relations program since 1996. She has been a frequent speaker at past Franklin Public Library Great Decision discussion series. Tonight we are talking about the future, oh no, sorry, I didn't change my slide, I apologize. We are talking about Biden's foreign policy agenda tonight. So I will turn over the mic to Dr. Dougherty.
Great, well, can everybody hear me? Is that good? Yeah, okay. I'm really excited to be here. I think this may be the first time that I've been in public other than at school since the pandemic started, so it's good to get out of my house again. So I spoke at Manitowoc on this same topic on February 22nd, which was 2 days before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in between then and now, basically our world has been turned upside down. And I will get to that in a moment, but the things that we were wondering whether they were possible 12 days ago, rapidly fell into place. And so really, mainly what I am going to talk about tonight is the conflict in Ukraine and the role that the United States is playing there. So Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been an all-out assault on what we call the liberal international order, and it is radically restructuring the global system. The attack on Ukraine is the most brazen assault on international order since World War II. Vladimir Putin wants to fundamentally reset the global balance of power, right, and change the governing logic of the international system that has prevailed since the end of World War II. We're at one of those historic inflection points, right, when the entire structure of the system shifts. So collapse of the Soviet Union leads to the post-Cold War, 9/11, and now people are going to talk about the world after Ukraine because things have massively shifted just in the space of under 2 weeks. So before I go any further, I just want to explain a little bit about what we mean about liberal world order, because I think it's important to lay out what the stakes are in what's happening in Ukraine. So there's 3 different aspects of the liberal world order: the security aspect, the economic aspect, and the human rights aspect. So the security part of the liberal international order set up a rules-based system, right, where international law and the United Nations Charter lay out what states are allowed and prohibited from doing. It is a rules-based system, right, where the UN Security Council is the final arbiter of what states can and cannot do. Non-use of force except in self-defense is the cornerstone of that entire system that was set up after World War II. Okay? Respect for other states' territorial integrity is another cornerstone of that security order. And it has been largely successful. Between 1945 and today, there have actually been very few interstate wars. In other words, wars between two states. Right? Most of the wars that we are familiar with in recent decades have been civil wars. But interstate war, there were only about 5 since the end of the Cold War, and one of them was the US invasion of Iraq, and the other was the US invasion of Afghanistan. So, I mean, this is a very successful to that extent, and there's not been great power conflict, right, since the end of World War II. And the whole point of setting that order up after World War II was precisely to prevent great power conflict, especially in Europe. The economic part of the liberal international order is also a rules-based system, right? It's upheld by the Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. It is premised on the idea of open markets and free trade. The idea has long been that the more states interact and trade with one another, the closer the ties of interdependence become, and the less likely it is that states will want to disrupt those ties by engaging in aggressive action. And then the third aspect of it is the human rights order. This piece developed much more slowly than the economic or the security order, but it has become especially important and much more deeply entrenched since the end of the Cold War, roughly 1989 to 1991 period. Right, where we saw a push towards representative multi-party democracies that respected the civil and political rights of their citizens, greater tendency to think about humanitarian intervention. In this post-World War II liberal order, the United States has been the linchpin that has provided and helped secure what we would think of as public goods. So in other words, things like international security, lack of great power war, free trade, freedom of navigation, financial stability. But Russia and China have long chafed at the liberal international order. They see this as an order set up by the United States to benefit the United States, right? And a way to continue American power and prestige at their expense. They resent and fear many elements of the liberal international order as a threat to their legitimacy and even to their ability to stay in power. And this is where the human rights piece of the liberal international order comes in particular. Neither Putin nor Xi are interested in representative government and respecting the civil and political rights of their own populations. But in recent years, the liberal international order has been in turmoil. After years of a steady expansion of democratic government, we have seen since 2005, 16 straight years of democratic decline, according to Freedom House, which every year it puts out its report on freedom in the world, so it has a rating system that is widely used. So this is just showing in any given year the number of countries that improved their democratic score, right, on the top. And the bottom, the number of countries that have declined. And so for 15 straight years, more countries have become less democratic than have become more democratic, reversing a trend that went from 1990 all the way till 2005. In addition to the democratic backsliding just worldwide, in particular, we have seen a decline in democracy in the United States and a questioning of the American commitment to the liberal international order and its role as an international leader under the Trump administration. The US score has declined just several points over the last number of years, but nonetheless, it is significant that the United States has fallen below its peer group, right, in important aspects of democratic governance. So with the liberal international order in turmoil, with democratic backsliding happen, the uncertainty over American leadership, we've also seen a really assertive foreign policy on the part of Russia and China over recent years. And ever since Biden has been elected, there has been this discussion that we are returning to an era of strategic competition between the United States and predominantly China. I mean, really, until about 2 weeks ago, if you had asked most people in American foreign policy circles who the major challenger was to American leadership or the biggest threat to global security, it would have been China, not Russia. Yeah. And so Russia and China have wanted to undermine and replace the liberal international order with their own version. And this is what Arch Punnington has called modern authoritarianism, right? Which has features such as majoritarianism, where the winner takes all with no checks and balances. And you can see Putin is gearing up for the next election in Russia. Right? It will not be free and fair. Previous elections were not free and fair. There is no one within the Russian system who is capable of standing up to Vladimir Putin. In both Russia and in China, human rights standards are seen as interference in their domestic affairs. And both countries have become more blatant in their abuses of human rights in recent years. I would note, because this will come up later, for the Russians, the revisionist history, the rewriting of historical narratives to bolster the legitimacy of the government that is in power. And I will lay out for you in a moment the way in which Putin has done this with respect to Ukraine. Another aspect of the challenge that China and Russia have been making to the liberal international order is something that we've come to call transnational repression. And so it used to be that if you were an activist or an advocate or a government opponent and your life was at risk, you would leave the country and go into exile, and you could continue your operations from abroad. But what China and Russia and other states, Rwanda, Saudi Arabia, right, have begun to do is reach beyond their own borders, right? So assassinate your opponents in other countries, right? This is the Vladimir Putin, the polonium, right? That he's poisoned several dissidents. Assassinations like the Saudi murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Right? Intimidation, right, of Uyghur families in Turkey, where eventually, after they continue to call and not get anything from their relatives, they get a return phone call from that phone number, and it's the Russian or the Chinese security forces warning them to stop speaking publicly about what's happening to the Uyghurs. So no longer content with simply trying to control their population and their own narratives at home, they have increasingly been reaching out and attempting to do that beyond their borders, and even doing it in the United States, in European states, in Canada, in ways that are very much a breach of the rules of international order. So I want to speak specifically about Vladimir Putin and the threat that Russia currently plays, not just to the United States, but literally to the entire global international order. Putin nurses a very deep sense of grievance. He has said that the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the biggest political tragedy of the 20th century. Right? And really what Putin is talking about here, apparently, is not necessarily the loss of the Soviet Union, the country, but the fact that Russian speakers in other lands ended up going away from Russia, right? Because when the Soviet Union broke up, I mean, the standard international practice is you divide along internal boundaries. And so all the various republics of the Soviet Union became independent. But you have significant populations of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in many of these countries, the 3 Baltic states, in Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, etc. So Putin Putin is nursing this kind of historical grievance about the collapse of Russian power, and he greatly fears the power of democracy to his regime, fearful that the trend of history towards more representative governments might swallow up his rule as well. He also wants to be treated as a great power. And the simple fact of the matter is that Russia was not a great power, right? Again, until fairly recently when it sort of foisted itself upon everyone. You know, Putin has this feeling that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the downgrading of Russian power was this tremendous humiliation. You may have heard the phrase that Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons, right? Which was an effort to kind of explain that basically the only reason why anyone would pay attention to Russia is because it has 6,000 nuclear warheads. But on any other kind of measurement of global power, they can't stack up to the United States or to the Chinese, right? The Chinese economy is much, much larger than that of the Russians. The one thing Russia has going for it, right, is energy and natural resources. So it's oil and it's natural gas. It has been clear over recent years that Putin has wanted to reverse the steady flow of Western power throughout Europe and assert a right to a Russian sphere of influence, right, in the areas that the Soviet Union previously controlled. So he has made quite clear that he wants the United States as well as NATO to withdraw forces from all of the countries that have joined recently, right? So basically, the 3 Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Romania, that arc of states around its border, Putin believes that NATO should never have expanded that far. Those states belong in the Russian sphere of influence, and so he wants to roll back the presence of NATO and create a new European security architecture. The problem for Putin, of course, has been NATO did not need to invade any of these countries or threaten any of them. They knocked on NATO's door, right? Many of them are very fearful of Russian power. The Baltic states, for example, I think really feel now like their warnings had been ignored for years about Russian power and the threat that Russia played to European security. Now they feel that the invasion of Ukraine has shown that they have been right all along. And this is part of what I think upsets Putin, is that the expansion of NATO eastward was in response to the requests of those states. Given the choice between 2 models, right, the modern authoritarianism of Vladimir Putin's Russia and the possibility of membership in the European Union, country after country after country turned in the direction of the European Union. Putin wants to be able to reverse that. He has spent years attempting to weaken and undermine the West, and the Ukraine crisis is just the latest piece of this. I actually think that part of the reason why Putin has gone all the way, right? He's trying to take the entire country, is precisely because he thinks that his efforts to weaken the West had borne fruit, right? Signs of democratic backsliding, signs of dissent and disunity within the United States. I think that he thought that if he invaded Ukraine, the West was not going to stop him. He badly miscalculated on that particular score. So he has a record of striking at any of his neighbors who appear to be moving too close to the West. So they have taken territory in Moldova, in Transnistria, where you have 1,500 Russian, quote unquote, peacekeepers who are stationed in Moldova. Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, which Putin fomented these separatist rebellions in Georgia after the revolution, the pro-democracy revolution in Georgia. And then in 2014, of course, he annexed Crimea. And again, I think he felt emboldened because he kind of got a slap on the wrist after 2014. He engaged in a great deal of disinformation. Some of you might remember that when they invaded Ukraine, the Russians denied they had any soldiers there, right? And Ukrainians took to calling them little green men as they were running around with their uniforms on, minus the insignia that showed they were from Russia, but they were clearly speaking Russian. Right? It was not, I mean, everyone knew these were Russian soldiers, but this was part of Russia's disinformation campaign. It has spent years investing in these kinds of campaigns in an effort to undermine the West. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine several months ago, the European Commission called Russian disinformation campaigns the greatest threat to the European Union because they said these disinformation campaigns were systematic, they were well-sourced, and they were perpetuated on a larger scale than similar campaigns by other states. Putin's regime uses disinformation to question the democratic legitimacy of the European Union and of the United States. Right? He uses it to polarize society by inflaming sensitive topics. He uses it to undermine trust in institutions and elites. Right? And of course, his most famous disinformation campaign in the United States would be interference in the election here in 2016. Okay? There are four main goals for these Russian disinformation campaigns. Okay? The first one is to roll back Western influence, right? Especially US influence, as a way for Russia to regain great power status. So competition between Russia and the US is a zero-sum game. If Russia wins, the US loses, and vice versa. Putin has seen that his disinformation campaigns can produce major domestic problems for the United States. It can force it to focus its energy and its resources internally. Okay? The next two of these main goals, and these are very closely related, he wants to preserve his sphere of influence, especially his near abroad, right? And he wants to keep Putin in power. So why did he go after the areas that he did in Ukraine? It's because these are the areas where the largest percentage of Russian speakers are. So a more favorable population to Putin. Right? And in particular in Luhansk and Donetsk, right? These were the two provinces. The separatists already control this area since 2014. And when there were those, again, a mere 12 days ago, when you had 100,000 Russian forces along the border with Ukraine, there was some discussion. What was Putin going to do? Did he want all of Ukraine? Did he want to decapitate the Ukrainian government? Or was he only going to take Luhansk and Donetsk, right? The likelihood that the West would do very much if that happens was pretty slim. It didn't do very much after he took Crimea and actually annexed it in 2014. And that was Putin's first step, if you remember. He declared Luhansk and Donetsk as independent, right? And then the assault on Ukraine as a whole came just a few days after that. Right? But these disinformation campaigns are really largely aimed at trying to keep Putin in power. These pictures represent Putin's greatest fear. Okay? The power of ordinary people to come out in large enough numbers to demand more democratic forms of government, right? To call for an end to corruption, for example. And it is not an accident that Putin went after Georgia, right? Not long after the Georgians engaged in the Rose Revolution, right? Or that the second Ukrainian pro-democracy movement, the Maidan Revolution in 2014, within 6 weeks, Putin had moved against Crimea, right? Because the pro-Russian government in 2014 was overthrown by the Ukrainians. And Putin is terrified that this could happen in Russia. So this bottom photo is from protests that happened in 2011. There were widespread protests around the elections that were happening in Russia. Vladimir Putin apparently blames Hillary Clinton personally for helping to foment these rebellions against his rule. But this is what he does not want to see. Apparently, Putin is haunted by what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, right? That he ended up in a drain pipe, right, before he was killed by his own people. That is not the fate that Putin sees for himself, right? And so a lot of what he does to try to keep himself in power in Russia, he has been portraying himself to his own people as, I can bring about stability, I can protect Russia from outside forces that are going after us. Right? And so this war is going to undermine this entire narrative that he has been telling about Russians, about his rule, for the last number of years. Okay. So the Russians have also been using state-controlled media to try to control messaging, not just at home, where, again, in Russia, the information bubble was pretty small even before the invasion and has now just constricted unbelievably. There's basically no independent media left to report what's happening in Russia. Okay. So Russia Today and Sputnik operate in 100 different countries in 30 different languages with budgets that are on par with that of the BBC and France 24, which is the French version of the public broadcasting system. The slick production values of Russia Today and Sputnik make it less identifiable as propaganda or disinformation. And you can see the degree to which the Russians have been successful in this because a lot of the coverage of the crisis in Ukraine in the build-up to the actual invasion framed it precisely as Putin wanted it to be framed, which was, this was NATO's fault because NATO moved too close to Ukraine's borders. Which completely leaves out what the Ukrainians wanted, right? As if just because Russia didn't want Ukraine to do something, Ukraine should be sacrificed on the altar of Russian desires. But that narrative, that this is all NATO's fault, that is a Russian disinformation narrative, and you hear it from prominent people, prominent news organizations in the United States. So the Russian disinformation narrative around Ukraine goes as follows. That Ukraine is running an anti-Russian project. It is a Western puppet and a hotbed of Nazis. That cooperation between Ukraine and the West poses a direct security threat to the Russians. That the Ukrainians and NATO are the aggressors. That Ukraine rightfully belongs in the Russian sphere of influence. That Ukraine and the US and NATO are actually planning false flag operations as a pretext to attacking the Russians. Okay? The joke in Russia, amongst those who have access to outside information has been, if you listened to Russian media, you would believe that Russia was a tiny country surrounded on three sides by an overpowering and threatening Ukraine. Right? But as you can see from this balance, right, the Ukrainians do not pose a military threat to the Russians on their own. And while NATO has an open door policy, which said that yes, Ukraine could eventually come into NATO, there was no date for Ukraine to move into NATO. And because in previous years, the military sector in Ukraine had been very corrupt, particularly under the pro-Russian government that was overthrown in 2014. It didn't meet the criteria for moving into NATO. So it's not as if NATO was going to induct Ukraine into the organization anytime soon. Again, this is an effort on the part of the Russians to create a narrative, to tell its own population, first of all, but also to sow discord and disunity amongst the West. But unfortunately, when it comes to Ukraine, it has been clear for at least a year since Putin published a lengthy article in which he discussed the history between Russia and Ukraine. It appears that he has been obsessed, and I would say actually delusional about Ukraine. The notion that Ukrainians and Russians are one people with one history is simply not borne out by the facts. And the invasion and the reaction of the Ukrainians has put paid to this entire narrative that Putin has been nursing again for years. There's real concern about Putin's mental state because he has been so severely isolated in COVID. He apparently has been terrified that he will catch the virus. Many of his meetings with his aides have been, by teleconference. So that's Putin actually meeting with his advisors, right? He's not meeting with anybody in person. And you may remember that photograph, that's Putin meeting with his national security council, in which he asked them one by one to give their blessing to the war in Ukraine. Apparently, they had not been told before they got there what they were supposed to say. And at least one person sort of flubbed his lines, which made Putin extremely angry. But I mean, he is afraid enough to keep this kind of distance. Is Putin meeting with Emmanuel Macron, right? The table that is approximately 20 feet long. And then Putin and his generals. This picture was taken when Putin was announcing that Russia was raising its nuclear alert. So he is dangerously isolated. He has, and I mean, this is always the problem for one-person regimes. You surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear because they're too afraid to tell you something you don't want to hear. And it seems clear now that we have seen what has happened in Ukraine, that Putin really did not have a good handle on his own military preparedness and what his military was actually capable of carrying out. So what has the Biden administration been doing about this situation? One of the first things, they started early. Okay? So as early as October, Mark Milley and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already started getting their people in the Pentagon to begin putting together scenarios about Russia's intentions towards Ukraine. Okay? And from the fall, long before the Russians had, the eventual 190,000 forces along the border, the Biden administration was closely, quietly, carefully coordinating with its NATO allies, right? One of Biden's promises, of course, as a candidate, and one of the major shifts in American foreign policy from the previous administration to now, is this increased emphasis on the use of multilateral tools, right? So, the Biden administration rejoined the World Health Organization. The administration allowed the United States to run for a seat on the UN, which it won, on the UN Human Rights Council. He's put together a new alliance between the US, the UK, and Australia to try to counter Chinese power in the Pacific. He has also been coordinating with Japan, India, and Australia. Again, another alliance that they are using to try to put pressure on what China is doing in the Pacific. So Biden had been his administration had been carefully kind of laying the groundwork with our European allies to ensure that if something happened, there would be some level of unity. And then the administration, many people in it had been in national security positions in 2014 when the Russians took Crimea. And they felt burned by what had happened, that they had information in advance which they could not share or did not share with the public, which left the United States unable to respond when the invasion actually took place. So this time, the administration made what turned out to be a strategically brilliant idea. which was they pre-bunked rumors that the Russian disinformation was spreading. In other words, they began sharing intelligence publicly, right? Not just with the allies, right? But with the world in general, coming out and saying, this is what the Russians are planning to do. The Russians are planning a false flag operation to try to give themselves a pretext for being able to intervene in Ukraine. By pre-bunking all of these rumors, right, they removed Putin's ability to shape the narrative from the beginning, right? If you say in advance, they're gonna start a false flag operation as a pretext, and then the Russians actually do that, well then it isn't a false flag anymore, right? Because everyone already knows what's going on. So the pre-bunking of rumors was critically important, right? To undermining an important part of Russia's typical strategy. The other reason it was important, right, was to reestablish credibility for the United States in the sharing of intelligence information. So some of you may recall Secretary of State Tony Blinken at the United Nations, right, sitting in the same seat that Colin Powell was sitting in when he gave the American briefing for war in Iraq in 2003, a speech which, as it turns out, was riddled with false intelligence claims. And Blinken was well aware of the fact that this is that still hangs over the United States. It's misuse of intelligence, right, for national security purposes. And Blinken said explicitly, I am not here to start a war, I am here to stop a war. The fact that what the Americans have been saying in public and what the administration has been sharing in greater detail in private with our allies continually came true, got all of the Europeans on the same page with the United States. It gave them more certainty about American credibility and American leadership. Because, again, 12 days ago, people still weren't sure that there was going to be a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Again, most of you are old enough to remember this. When in the weeks leading up to the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the Iraqis had 100,000 forces on their border, and even 2 days before they moved, you still had like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times saying, Iraqi troops are just there to put pressure on the Kuwaitis. If the Kuwaitis give them what they want about oil, pricing, and production, then they will go away. Well, there was an element of that going on too, right, with those troops, the Russians. Again, there was plenty of speculation that maybe they were only going to go for those two provinces. Right? So the intelligence piece and the pre-bunking of disinformation has been a really important and valuable strategy for the administration. Secondly, they have shown the importance of close coordination with our allies, the importance of using multilateral forums in order to be able to get what they want to move forward. So the U.S. organized a multi-pronged approach in advance of the Russian move on Ukraine. You do not put together the kinds of sanctions that have been placed on Russia. That doesn't come together overnight, and that doesn't come together without an enormous amount of planning, coordination, and cooperation. Right? And that has largely been the United States, right, helping its allies to move there. The administration was very careful not to get too far out in front, right, of some of its European allies. And as a result of this, and of course, the brutal and brazen nature of what Putin has done in Ukraine has meant that the Europeans and Britain have gone much, much further, much, much faster than anyone would have suspected 2 weeks ago. Another thing that the administration did in an effort to try to prevent the Russians from moving First, they told them they were open to negotiating about security architecture, right? They were willing to sit down at the table. If Russia really felt it had legitimate grievances, they were willing to talk about it. So gave them a diplomatic off-ramp if the Russians had wanted to take it. They did not, right? Again, there was some speculation about this, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, that might be enough for Putin, that what he really wanted was to be treated like a great power. And so if the West showed they were taking him seriously and were willing to sit down and treat him as an equal, maybe that would be enough for him, right? That clearly miscalculated what Putin was thinking about that, right? NATO and the United States have been carefully pre-positioning additional equipment and troops all along the borders, right? So especially in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, which are feeling extremely vulnerable to all of this. And so making it clear that if the Russians move on a member of NATO, NATO is ready for that. It is an effort at deterrence, a warning, do not cross any further. The United States and its NATO allies clearly do not want a great power conflict. So they're not going to put in ground forces, at least not yet, right? And probably, it's difficult to imagine the American public agreeing to allowing US forces to be deployed someplace when they have finally gotten Americans out of Iraq and Afghanistan after 2 decades. So Ukraine is going to have to fight more or less alone, with NATO supplying it with weapons and money and moral support, etc. Right? But the administration has been clear, right, that they are not contemplating putting American boots on the ground in Ukraine. So just to sort of catch us up to where we are at this point, so the BBC every day is publishing a set of maps showing precisely where the Russians are. So of course there is advancing on Kyiv, the capital. The idea, again, if you remember 12 days ago, people were worried that Kyiv was going to fall in 3 days, right? That Russia was just going to roll over Ukraine the way the Iraqis rolled over Kuwait in 1990. It hasn't happened for a whole variety of reasons. But you can get these maps, they have them broken down. This is a closer view of what's happening in Kyiv, where the Russians are as they move closer to the city itself. This is in the southern areas, right? And of course, Mariupol is where the children's and the maternity hospital was bombed today. And then showing the concerns about that the Russians are planning to make a move on Odessa. President Zelensky has been absolutely brilliant in this role. I don't think people really thought that, people didn't really know what to make of what was going to happen with Zelensky, right? He's not a career politician. He's actually a comedian. When he was 28, he won Ukrainian Dancing with the Stars, right? And those videos are on YouTube. He's actually quite amazing. But Zelensky's beating the Russians at their own game, right? He is beating the Russians at the information game, at the social media game. He has control of the narrative, right? He is the hero in this story. And Putin has cast himself as a Bond villain, right? Alone, isolated, right? Afraid to let anybody come close to him. Zelensky is showing that he's not afraid. He is showing the Ukrainians that, again, you can tell his acting background in the way they have put some of these things together. So the top video where they went in the early days of the invasion went out and they said over and over, I am here, we are here, making it clear they were not fleeing because that, again, Russian disinformation, that they were going to, the government was going to leave the capital. And Zelensky, by showing up in military fatigues repeatedly, is showing his own population that they're all in this together, that he also is fighting. He's been extraordinarily brave. And so he is young, media savvy, and appealing. And Vladimir Putin, who is 70 years old, right, is showing that he does not understand and has not mastered, right, the social media in the way that he thought he was. And he appears at this point to be extremely out of touch. He badly miscalculated about what Ukraine would do. He badly underestimated, or overestimated rather, his own military strength, right? And he vastly underestimated the willingness of the West to stand up to him. I do think he thought that after years of these disinformation campaigns, where you can see how many divisions in the United States, right, have been driven by Russian bots, Russian Facebook pages, et cetera, people deliberately trying to expand on American grievances, it's been successful. Right? And I think that Putin thought that the United States and its European allies were in a state of weakness. So Biden was in trouble in the United States. Trump remains popular. Britain is dealing with the aftermath of Brexit, so they're kind of alone. Macron is running for president again, so he was going to be focused on his own domestic issues. You have a brand new prime minister in Germany. Right? He thought the West was divided and internally focused, right, before he decided to move through this. Right? We've also seen small but nonetheless significant anti-war protests in Russia. Again, this is Putin's worst nightmare, and that is why he is desperate, right, to try to prevent any independent media. This is the law that was just passed that said you could get 15 years in prison if you referred to this as an invasion instead of a special military operation. One of the last independent media stations, Rain TV, were broadcasting live when their entire staff walked off the set. The last thing they said was no war, and then they ran Swan Lake. And the significance of this is that when Leonid Brezhnev died, when Yuri Andropov died, when Konstantin Chernenko died, Soviet state TV ran Swan Lake. When the coup against Mikhail Gorbachev happened in 1991, they ran Swan Lake, right? So this was a highly political statement that they were making by showing this Russian ballet as their last act. Unfortunately, the Russian playbook, which we've seen in Grozny, in Chechnya, and in Syria, is the Russians have absolutely no respect for international humanitarian law. They deliberately target civilians. These are not accidental or incidental. That is the strategy, to terrorize civilians. We saw in Grozny that Putin was willing to literally flatten the city. By the time the second war in Chechnya was over in 1999, the UN estimated there was not a single building in Grozny that was not damaged or destroyed from the fighting. The Russians used this strategy in Syria to make sure that Assad stayed in power. And so the Russians used the cover of the aerial bombardment campaign against the Islamic State to carry out its own aerial bombardments against cities like Aleppo. And of course, it was clear in Syria that their strategy included the deliberate targeting of medical facilities, right? oftentimes there would be a strike on a location, and once medical personnel came to start carrying victims away, there would be a second strike. They deliberately targeted hospitals. That is what we are going to continue to see in Ukraine. And so the concern moving forward is very much what the civilian death toll is likely to be. We've already seen well over 1 million Ukrainians have fled the country. UNHCR is estimating there could be 5 million that leave by the time, over the next several months. At least at this point, countries that previously had turned their backs on refugees, Poland with Syrian refugees, have been welcoming the Ukrainians with open arms. So some of the actions that have been taken by the international community with American leadership against the Russian invasion have been quite historic. The UN General Assembly actually called an emergency session. So, at the Security Council, the Russians have the veto. So there was no way the Security Council could condemn what the Russians had done because they vetoed it. However, you cannot veto a procedural matter at the UN. And there are certain things that are considered procedural matters, including sending something to the General Assembly for an emergency session. So the United States and one of the African countries on the Security Council sponsored this resolution. It was only the 11th time that the General Assembly has been called into an emergency special session to call for the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of forces from Ukraine. And because of the toll the war has been taking on children, a lot of the delegations put stuffed animals around their nameplates when they were casting their votes. The level of condemnation was pretty overwhelming for the Russians. Only 5 countries voted with Russia. Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, Russia itself, and Syria. There were 35 abstentions, some of them from allies of the Russians, some of them because they say they are non-aligned and so they didn't want to take a stand on this, and some of them, like China, because they are in a very difficult situation with this, right? They see Russia as a friend and ally. Simultaneously, they can see the international community has been unified in a way that we have not seen really since Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. It's just a list of some of the major sanctions that have been put into place against the Russians. Again, it was unbelievable. 12 days ago, it was still sort of like, well, if the Russians go against Ukraine, do you think that they'll get kicked off of SWIFT? Are the Germans really going to close the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, right? Is anybody going to boycott oil and gas? All of these things were seen as really hard asks that were unlikely to happen, and yet all of them have fallen into place over the last several days. The most recent, of course, being the United States announcing that it was going to ban all imports of Russian energy products. This is not actually that hard for the United States because we don't get very much from the Russians. The UK said they're going to ban Russian energy by the end of the year, and the European Union has pledged to reduce their reliance on Russian energy by 2/3. There have been a few publications that have floated the idea that there's a new Iron Curtain descending between Russia and the rest of the world. It is isolated to a degree we have never seen for a major world economy. It has been completely cut off. Its soccer team isn't allowed to play in the World Cup. There are no civilian flights that are going in and out of Russian airspace. Russians can't use Apple Pay because they cut that off. So it's not just that we're targeting Putin and the oligarchs, but ordinary people are also really feeling this. And again, it's amazing, the international condemnation and the force of public pressure, because a few days ago, right, there were about 100 companies that had cut off their ties with the Russians. Today, there are over 300 companies, right, and Coca-Cola, Pepsi, McDonald's, all announced that they are pulling out of or closing down in Russia, which, again, 2 days ago, they were not willing to do that. There's a professor at Yale who started this list of companies that have pulled out and haven't pulled out, right? And he's constantly being contacted by companies that want him to shift him from one side of that list to the other. The irony of all of this may be, Putin's ultimate goal of weakening the West. The invasion of Ukraine has done more to give NATO a sense of purpose and to bring the United States and its European allies back together again, right, than anything that they probably could have thought of on their own. The nature of what Putin has done in Ukraine, right? The blatant nature of invading a much smaller country, the fact that they are going after civilians, the incredibly, the demands that just simply cannot be met, like NATO has to leave every place that expanded in the 1990s, have made Russia into an international pariah. And I think we have had the good fortune that we have a national security team at this point that is extremely experienced, right? Joe Biden had more foreign policy experience than any American president since George H.W. Bush, the first George Bush, who also happened to be in office when Iraq invaded Kuwait and was able to put together the coalition that ultimately led to Operation Desert Storm, which to this point has been the largest and most effective multilateral coalition that we've ever seen. Biden is doing a lot of that now in response to what is happening in Ukraine. So I'll just end with the one thing that the administration to this point has said that the United States is not going to do, right? Which is a no-fly zone. Right? And there's a lot of discussion about putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And there's a very simple reason why the U.S. is not going to do that at this point, and that is the administration is trying to avoid a wider war. If you put a no-fly zone over Ukraine, you have to patrol that no-fly zone. And patrolling that no-fly zone means two things. The first one is your planes could get shot down by Russian anti-aircraft guns. And secondly, your planes could shoot at Russian planes or at Russian anti-aircraft defenses on the ground. And then you are not just talking about war in Ukraine, you are talking about a full-fledged war in Europe. And there are already concerns that the administration is trying very carefully to ensure that it can get military aid to Ukraine in a way that will not allow the Russians to claim NATO or the US or any specific NATO country as a combatant in this war, because that is the danger that lurks over all of this. Putin has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And what is concerning to me is that all of the national security and Russian experts whose opinions I value, every time they get asked the question, they say, will Putin use a nuclear weapon? And they're like, we can't say no. It is actually a possibility. So the stakes really could not be higher for the United States, for Europe, and for the Ukrainians in this war. So I'd be happy to take any questions, comments, etc., that anybody has.
Okay, I can can pass the microphone around. I'll give one quick tip about the microphone. You kind of have to talk right into it. We found that out last week.
Of course, I condone the atrocities that are happening in Ukraine. I was 7 years old in East Germany when the Russian came in, and we had the same experience. And with our suitcases, we were expelled. However, I'd like to offer a different perspective from the Russian side. Russia was a great power under the Tsars. It was a great power under the Soviet Union. It still is a great power. A country that has 2,000 nuclear warheads and the delivery system that can wipe out Milwaukee by tomorrow morning is not a little power. Back to Ukraine. Ukraine, as I understand, is the cradle of Russian entity, language, and culture. And from the Russian perspective, it's a border country that a great power will not allow to have foreign takes at their border 600 miles from Moscow. For example, I would like to cite Cuba. We did not allow Russian missiles in Cuba. We had the Manger doctrine. We did not allow European powers to settle on the Western Hemisphere close to the United States border. We would never allow to have Russian tanks at the Mexican border. So what I'm saying is there's some sort of a provocation when the talk was that Ukraine would become NATO. Why? If that were the case, we would have the tanks 600 miles from Moscow. And a great country like Russia will never allow that.
So
That's my point.
I would push back on several things here. The Cuban Missile Crisis, right? They were putting nuclear warheads in Cuba. Nothing is happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, of course, and I'm sure they probably now regret this, they actually gave up their nuclear weapons, right, at the time. And the Russians signed a treaty with the Ukrainians.
They were foolish with the Belgrade Agreement. They gave them up with guarantees, and now they don't have the guarantees.
The Russians signed the agreement that said they would respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty in return for them to move those nuclear weapons. Again, the problem with that narrative is just because Russia believes and thinks that, the Ukrainians have a very different feeling, right? The Ukrainians see themselves as a separate people from the Russians. They don't want to be controlled by Russia, right? And that again is where a lot of these analogies break down, right? The Mexicans are not inviting the Chinese or the Russians onto their soil, and they do not want either of them there. The East European countries and the Ukrainians, Russia is a threat to them. And that's what they're looking for. But again, Ukraine was not going to join NATO. There are not NATO missiles in Ukraine. Ukraine was in no way a threat to
They had an offer that in the future they would be able to join.
Again, why should Russia be allowed to dictate the choices of another state? Especially, again, a state that believes its history is separate from that of the Russians. The problem with yes, Russia was a great power under the Soviet Union, but unfortunately the nature of power changed in the post-Cold War era. It wasn't anymore just about who had nuclear weapons. It became about whose economy was the most competitive. And on that scale, the Russians are not even in the top 10. The Chinese economy is so much larger than theirs, and of course, so is the American economy. The Russians were finding it very difficult, right, to compete with the European Union because their political system has meant they have a very distorted economic system. And so, yes, Russia had become almost an afterthought, except it has 6,000 warheads.
I mean, I'm German, and Germany imports 40% of the gas from Russia and oil, so they are leery about putting all these sanctions on.
The Germans cut off Nord Stream 2, and the European Union, I mean, many countries like the Baltic states and Poland have been telling the Germans for years, you cannot buy all your gas from the Russians. You're setting yourselves up for this. Well, now the Germans can see that. Putin has done something that the United States has been unable to get Germany to do in the last 40 years, increase its defense spending to 2%. Right? The Germans would not do that. That has been a point of contention for a very long time. And in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, that was one of the first things the German government announced. They would ensure its defense spending went up to 2%. So again, if what Putin was trying to do is to protect Russian security from NATO and from outside threats, he has completely done the opposite with this.
Hi. You covered so many topics that it is difficult for me to start from where. Human rights first. Well, we turn a blind eye to many countries who does torture and does not take human rights very well. In that case, it could be Saudi Arabia, Israel, India. Just because they are our allies, we turn a blind eye towards them. Secondly is, we also bombarded Iraq. 500,000 people have been killed, and we were good in giving the name of collateral damage. So we bombarded hospitals, we killed civilians, we killed innocent kids. And thirdly is, when we look at the foreign policy, we are forced to believe that it is double standard. When we look at the aid, even though Israel is self-sufficient, self-efficient, nuclear, and so much advanced, and it has also spied on us. But despite that, we give $3.8 billion every year to Israel, which we need for our Medicare, medical needs, for our disabled children, disabled people, elderly population, our Medicare, our pension, Social Security, and all that. And there are issues like freedom of press too. If you are looking at that, we put Julian Assange in prison just because he violated Espionage Act. But at the same time, if you look at New York Times, Washington Post, they also did publish the classified information. We did not do anything against them. So there are many other issues, and you talked about this gentleman, you gave the answer that why Russia should dictate the terms to the other state when Russia itself is having this existential threat, like we did when they were deploying the missiles in Cuba. We stopped Prince Kennedy stopped him, but at the same time there was a deal that it didn't come out in public, mostly, that we took away the missiles from Turkey. So it was ongoing. If you look at United Nations, you talked about United Nations too. India is doing so many things not even under the carpet, it is doing openly. It took away the Kashmir status that United Nations gave, and we did not do anything.
All right, let me just.
All right.
So even if I grant you that everything that you said is correct, does that justify what the Russians are doing in Ukraine?
No, that is.
I mean,
It is not. We are not. I mean, say like I'm just thinking about like a layperson that if you are putting the sanctions on Russia, it is backfiring on us. Our gas prices are going record high. I'm not from Russia. I'm not from Ukraine. I'm from India. So it is totally different. I'm just talking to you in a lay terms of a
again, but this is whataboutism, right? The United States invaded Iraq. Yes, it did. The United States harmed its credibility, right? It lied about the intelligence. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives, right? The United States tortured all of those things are true. It does not in any way, shape, or form mean that Putin and Russia should not be condemned for bombing a maternity hospital.
Absolutely true. I agree with you. At the same time, we put the sanctions on Russia very soon, like 10 days before. You mentioned that it was a different scenario. After giving the presentation after February 28th, now it is different scenario. Same will be after a few months. China will go for Taiwan, which is very much likely that will we do the same thing of sanctions for China?
Well, because the Chinese may very well be rethinking. They may have been thinking, if Putin overruns Ukraine in a couple of days, we can just take Taiwan. China's going to think twice now before it does that. The Chinese are already recalibrating, right? Because China actually is sensitive to international opinion. So when the question of the Libya intervention came up at the Security Council, the Chinese abstained on that, largely because Arab League states were calling for an intervention. And China didn't want to damage its relationship or its standing in the Arab world by seeming to side with Muammar Gaddafi. So they abstained. They let that mission go forward. So China may be recalibrating, right, with respect to its relationship with Putin. Because, I mean, they have a much bigger stake in ensuring that the global economy runs smoothly. And so the fact that the international community has been able to come together to condemn what Putin is doing in Russia, again, may make the Chinese rethink what they were planning to do, if they were planning to do anything, but it may make them rethink what their options are in Taiwan.
I just want to mention, I want to get around to everybody in the room who wants to ask a question, so if you could make your questions kind of brief. And Dr. Dougherty will be here after the program if you want to talk to her personally.
Thank you, Dr. Dougherty, is that the correct? For a very articulate and concise presentation. I'm asking you to put your strategist hat on 6 months from now. Let's assume for a minute that just the overwhelming weight of the Russian military does finally accomplish the goals. The question is, now Russia physically has possession of that goal of theirs. Simple question, and then what? So the West is looking at it just as Hitler absorbed Czechoslovakia, and now what? So is there regime change in your mind as the only alternative to change this question?
So do you mean regime change in Russia?
Yes, because what else is going to change, restore Ukraine's independence?
So I think the concern right now is that there doesn't appear to be an off-ramp for Putin, right? A way for him to get out of Ukraine that allows him to save face, right? So the concern is that they'll double down to try to make sure that they take all of Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians probably can't hold out forever. They just simply are not, military equipment, et cetera. They're just, it's an overwhelming force. And again, the Russians are willing to play dirty and go after civilians. But if the Russians are able to control all or most of Ukraine, then I think there are two historical analogies that are pertinent. One is what happened to the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, right? Because it seems likely that there is going to be an insurgency in Ukraine. The population is not going to take this occupation and just accept that. And the second one is the US experience in Iraq, right? So the Soviets have about 190,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine, and I mean, that's as far as they've been able to get. At its height, the US had about 160,000 troops in Iraq, fighting with the Iraqi government. And it took them years to defeat the insurgency, right? 190,000 forces is not enough forces to be able to control a country the size of Ukraine. And the Russians would have to send additional forces in there. And so unfortunately, my fear is that what is likely to happen in Ukraine is that this turns into a bloody insurgency. Until there is some way to figure out how to get the Kremlin to negotiate. But it's going to have to, it's going to have to negotiate a withdrawal. Maybe it gets to keep Crimea. Right? Maybe the Ukrainians will say, fine, leave the rest of it, you can take Crimea with you. But right now, there does not seem to be any sense that the Russians are willing to negotiate in good faith. So they may have, the invading and controlling is the easy part, right? It's what comes after that, the occupation piece. Because a relatively small but highly dedicated group can do an enormous amount of damage to a military. And we've already seen signs that there's morale issues in the Russian forces, right? That some of the conscripts didn't know where they were. They're not happy shooting at people. Many of them have friends or family that are from Ukraine. And so, even if Putin is able to eventually control Ukraine, that is not going to be an end to the war. It'll transition into something different.
All on that side of the room.
I can talk loud. It's a fast question. Do you think, since China is very concerned about their opinion in the world, could they be helpful in this process? Thought I heard something about them talking with Russia. What is your take on their involvement in ending things, or?
Yeah, so the Chinese do have an important role to play here because they can be they're about the only major economy that the Russians have access to now because of all of the international sanctions. And so trade between the two of them is going to be important for Russia to replace what it's losing from everywhere else. The Chinese, again, Xi had similar sorts of ambitions, and the Chinese have been extremely assertive in their diplomacy over the last number of years. In China, they call it wolf warrior diplomacy. It's a reference to a popular movie. But wolf warrior diplomacy is that the Chinese are not going to take any slights or humiliations. And so their diplomats, for example, on social media accounts have been very sharp and critical in a variety of different settings. That the Chinese have sharp elbows now diplomatically. And it's started to have a bit of a backlash because countries that turn to the Chinese because they don't lecture them about their human rights records were becoming uncomfortable with China's demands. Again, I'm not a China specialist, so it's difficult for me to know what Xi is thinking. Beyond the fact that I think that China actually could be persuadable. They're not going to come out against the Russians. I think that would be highly doubtful. But actually getting the Chinese to sort of abstain would be important, right? Because what the Russians are going to be looking for is full support. And international public opinion pressure might be enough to convince the Chinese that they need to step carefully. They have this Belt and Road initiative that where they're investing in all these infrastructure projects all the way through the Middle East and through Asia. So they have relations with a lot of different states where they have invested huge sums of money. And they see the Belt and Road Initiative as a chief way for them to exercise their power. They're not going to want to damage those relationships over support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Anybody want to ask a question?
I was listening to something recently, and I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but it was about the economics of maybe the average Russian is maybe 800. I don't know if this would be the average wealth of a Russian family would be like $871. It was lower than India. I was really surprised. I had no idea how poor the average Russian is. And to your point about not being a big economic power, and the corruption, all of the oligarchs and everything. I mean, it's surprising there isn't more dissent.
So I think there's two things about that. One is the state-controlled media environment, so that people oftentimes all their information that they're getting is coming from the government. So it's a narrative that has been shaped by years of Putin's explanation of Russian history and Russia's place in the world and the threat that's coming from NATO in the West, etc. Not everybody, especially older people, aren't looking on social media, right? Aren't looking at Instagram and TikTok to find out what's happening elsewhere. So it's a pretty closed media environment. And then the other piece is you have to be courageous to go out onto the streets and protest in Russia, because of the possibility that you could end up serving years in prison. And that's what, they put those protests down in 2011. They sent the chief opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, is in a penal colony right now. They closed down Memorial, which is the major human rights organization in Russia. That had already been closed down. So, people have to think carefully about whether or not they want to go out into the street, whether or not they want to publicly say anything against the war. Lots of journalists have just fled in the last couple of days because of the fake news law. As Russian casualties creep up, it'll be harder and harder to insulate the population from finding out what's happening in Ukraine. And this is why I think Putin is so desperate now to close down as many information outlets as he can. But I was just thinking about this the other day about ways in which people could protest without getting themselves arrested. And the kind of example that I thought of is what the mothers of the Playa de Mayo did in Argentina during the dictatorship and the Dirty War, right? Where they went out on the same day every week and held up pictures of their disappeared children. That's all they did, right? They didn't have any slogans, they didn't say it, they just marched around with pictures of their dead children. And the Argentine dictatorship didn't really know what to do about this because they had very much were playing up kind of this notion of Christian family values. How do you arrest mothers who are holding pictures of their children? Mothers of Russian soldiers potentially could try something like that. But again, it's very easy for all of us to say that because we can say whatever we want and go outside and protest, and nobody's going to send us to prison for 15 years. But the people in Russia are risking a lot to come out against this regime.
It's my understanding that Russia's really only economic force is energy production. Aren't we really playing into his hand right now if we are driving the price of energy through the roof? Is this not making him and his oligarchs that much richer, that much more powerful with the prices?
So yes, the price of this will, but the problem is, for example, so Shell and BP have pulled out of their Russian oil ventures. the Russian gas company has a major debt payment that is due in a couple of weeks, but it's dollar denominated, right? And they don't have the dollars to be able to pay that. I do have some related with my Russian energy slides. I thought I had them in here. Energy. Ah, yes. Yes, Russia has the largest proven reserves of natural gas in the world. It is one of the top 5 producers of oil. And many European countries rely heavily on the Russians for natural gas. And like I said, for years, the Poles and the Baltics in particular, have been telling the Germans, you cannot buy that much gas from the Russians, you are setting yourself up for political blackmail. Because the Russians have turned the gas off in Georgia and Ukraine at different times when they've been having arguments with those states. And so the Russian energy sector is going to find it increasingly difficult. Even if they're producing, someone has to buy it. And now lots of places are saying they're not going to. And that was just something people did not think that there would be sanctions on Russian energy because of the reliance of so many European countries on that. But it's also gas sales in Germany from Russia is highly seasonal. So as the weather gets warmer, demand for gas is going to drop off dramatically. It gives the Europeans just a little bit of time to try and come up with other places where they might be able to replace some of that supply. But it is likely that, because even before this happened, demand for oil and gas had gone way down with COVID because nobody ever left their houses, nobody went anywhere, right? And so a lot of oil production facilities and things went offline, and it takes a lot longer to put them back online and then ramp back up again. So we were already kind of, supply was outstripping demand because of this kind of COVID hangover, and now to lose the Russian supply to the international energy market is going to make prices quite high, at least in the short term, until we have a better sense of what's going on.
Okay, you have
One
time
last
for
question.
one more short question. We have 3 minutes.
What were the demands that Russia has preventing the war in Ukraine, and why did the West reject them?
So the demands were that NATO say that Ukraine could never ever, those were their words, never ever join NATO. And they wanted NATO forces out of all of the places that NATO had expanded. So Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, etc. The Russians wanted NATO forces out of all of those countries. And what NATO said to the Russians is, we're willing to sit down and negotiate your legitimate security concerns. If you want to restart the intermediate nuclear talks, we'll do that. If you want to talk about where missiles are, we'll talk about that. But we will not withdraw our forces from countries that are already part of NATO. So they would have sat down and talked. It was the Russians basically issued an ultimatum on that. And again, it's just not reasonable. Poland has and Hungary and Czech Republic and Slovakia, they have real reason to be fearful of Russian military power, historically speaking. Why should they not be allowed to protect themselves?
Thank you. If you could just go back to my slides. The next slide.
Trying to find a slideshow on here without my glasses on.
Oh, there. Okay, thank you for coming. Our next week, we'll have a DVD roundtable discussion on industrial policy. And then our final Great Decisions program on March 23rd will be drug policy in Latin America with Peter Cranstover, who's a retired Foreign Service officer with USAID. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I mentioned Dr. Dougherty will be here if you would like to speak with her after.